The paper in my hand was trembling so hard I had to press it flat against the desk just to read it. And 24 hours earlier, I had walked into this bank thinking I might be able to scrape together enough money for groceries. That is not an exaggeration. Yesterday morning, I still had a job. By lunchtime, I didn't. By dinner, my ex-wife had turned my humiliation into public entertainment. And by the time the sun came up today, I was driving to a little old bank in northern Kentucky to empty out the only account I had left in my name, besides a checking account that looked like it had been mugged. My name is Warren Cole. I'm 54 years old, divorced, and until yesterday, I had spent 26 straight years helping another man build an empire, with my time, my energy, my marriage, and pieces of my life I'll never get back. I missed my daughter Ellie's first dance recital because I was trying to lock down a fleet account in Louisville. I missed my son Mason's high school graduation because Bryce Harlan needed me in Columbus for the opening of dealership number 9. My marriage didn't collapse all at once. It eroded, quietly, like wood taking on water. I was never home, and when I was home, my phone was glued to my hand while I handled crises that somehow always became mine, even when I hadn't created them. For years I told myself that was the price of loyalty. That if I kept showing up, kept solving problems, kept carrying Bryce's company on my back, eventually that loyalty would come back around. Yesterday, Bryce Harlan proved exactly how foolish that belief was. He sat behind a desk I had helped him earn, in an office paid for by deals I had negotiated, looked straight at me, and said, "Clean out your office, Warren. You're finished." No thank you. No severance speech. No acknowledgement of the 26 years I had poured into that business. He didn't even bother getting to his feet. He said it with this smug little look on his face, like letting me go was the most entertaining part of his day. I rent a one-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner in a town where I used to matter. I drive a pickup with more than 200,000 miles on it and a check engine light that has been glowing at me since October. My kids love me, but they worry about me more than grown children should have to worry about their father. And yesterday, after I got fired, my ex-wife Denise decided to make sure everybody else had front row seats to the wreckage too. She posted on Facebook for the whole world to see. "Heard the big news? Guess some people really do top out at ordinary." Her husband, Trent, a real estate guy who still tucks polo shirts into pressed khakis, dropped a laughing emoji under it. 47 people liked the post. Yes, I counted. I wish I hadn't, but I did. So this morning, I woke up with no job, no plan, and what felt like no pride left. I checked my balance, did the math, and after rent, utilities, and the minimum payment on a credit card I never should have opened, I had about $1,100 left in the world. Then I remembered the little account, an old savings account at Heritage Bank in Covington. My grandfather Calvin had opened it the day I was born. I hadn't touched it in decades. In my head, it held maybe $900, maybe a little less. Not life-changing money, not even close. But when you're standing at the edge of a cliff, $900 feels like something solid to grab onto. So I drove to the bank planning to close it, take whatever was left, and buy myself a little time. Instead, a teller turned pale when she typed in my account number. Then she excused herself and disappeared. A few minutes later, a polished man in an expensive suit came out, introduced himself as Martin Vale, Senior Vice President, and asked if I would step into his office because there was something important we needed to discuss about my account. I followed him down a hallway thinking this had to be bad. Maybe there had been a clerical mix-up. Maybe the account had some fee attached to it. Maybe I owed money I didn't know existed. Frankly, that would have fit the mood of the last 24 hours perfectly. But when I sat down in his office, Martin looked at me like a man trying to tell somebody something so unbelievable he didn't expect to be believed. Then he said, "Mr. Cole, this is not an ordinary savings account. Your grandfather tied a private holding to it long before you were old enough to understand what he'd done." I didn't even get to ask what that meant. The side door opened, security stepped in, and behind them came a woman in a dark navy blazer carrying a leather case. She looked at me, extended her hand, and said, "Good morning, Chairman Cole." That sentence knocked every bit of air out of my lungs. To explain how a man can go from jobless and publicly humiliated to being called chairman inside a small-town bank, I have to take you back to the beginning. Because none of this makes any sense unless you understand who my grandfather was, what kind of man he made me, and just how completely I had convinced myself my life was over. And I mean that sincerely. If you had told me 24 hours earlier what was waiting for me in that bank, I would have thought you were either confused or cruel. I grew up in Covington, Kentucky, in a house small enough that if someone whispered in the front room, you could hear it from the kitchen. It was me and my mother, Ruth. My father left when I was 6, not the dramatic kind of leaving you see in movies. No shouting, no slammed front door, no suitcase in the hallway. He went out one afternoon to buy cigarettes and never returned. No note, no phone call, no explanation. Just absence. My mother waited 3 weeks before she changed the locks. She never poisoned me against him, never sat me down and unloaded bitterness into my lap. But I saw what it did to her. I saw it in the way her face changed every time I asked if she thought he might come back. She didn't have an answer because he never gave her one. The man who stepped into the empty place my father left behind was my grandfather, Calvin Cole. He was my father's father, and I think some part of him carried shame over what his son had done, even though he never said it outright. Calvin owned a 2-bay repair shop on the east side of town, and had spent most of his life under hoods and under cars, fixing other people's problems with his hands and not much talk. He wasn't flashy. He didn't make speeches. He wore the same work boots until the leather softened and the soles went nearly smooth. But every Saturday morning, he picked me up in his truck and took me to the shop. That garage is where I learned half the lessons that built my life. He taught me how to patch a tire, how to change oil, how to tell when an engine was about to give you trouble by listening before you ever opened the hood. He taught me to look people in the eye when I shook their hand. He taught me that showing up matters, that doing what you said you'd do matters, that being dependable is a kind of wealth most people don't appreciate until it's missing. When I was 16, he sat me down in that garage during a hard spring rain. Water was ticking against the metal roof, and the whole place smelled like grease and wet pavement. He said, "Warren, I opened an account for you at Heritage Bank the day you were born. Promise me something. Don't close it. Not if you're broke. Not if you're scared. Not if you think it's pointless. You leave that account where it is." I remember almost smiling because it sounded so serious for what I assumed was a little savings account with a few $100s in it. But my grandfather was not a man who asked for promises for fun. If he asked, he meant it. So I promised him. And I kept that promise. Calvin died in 2001. Heart attack in his sleep. I was 31 years old when my mother called me before sunrise and said the words I can still hear as clearly as if she whispered them this morning. "He's gone, baby." I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark and cried harder than a grown man thinks he's allowed to cry. It felt like being 6 years old all over again. Except this time, the man who disappeared was the one who had stayed. By then, I had already been working for Bryce Harlan for 3 years. I got that job in 1998 when I was 28. I'd tried community college twice and dropped out both times. Not because I couldn't handle the work, because life didn't care whether I had homework. Bills came anyway. My mother needed help with the house. I needed steady income. So I worked. Oil changes, loading trucks, stocking shelves at a hardware store. Whatever paid. Then one afternoon I saw a help wanted sign at Bryce Harlan's used car lot on Route 17. Back then it was barely more than a patch of pavement, a dozen cars, and a trailer that passed for an office. Bryce was 33, loud, ambitious, and completely certain he was destined to become the biggest dealer in the tri-state area. What he didn't have yet was somebody who could actually build the machinery behind that dream. That ended up being me. I started out washing cars, moving inventory, doing the jobs nobody brags about. Within a year, I was fixing the books, because the guy Bryce hired kept making mistakes I couldn't ignore. Within 2 years, I was managing sales. Within 5, I was overseeing operations for multiple locations. I built our inventory tracking system from nothing. I trained nearly every sales manager who came through those doors. I created processes Bryce later claimed he'd always envisioned. I brought in fleet contracts from companies Bryce had never even heard of until I put them in front of him. By the time Harlan Automotive stretched across Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana with 11 locations and hundreds of employees, the business was bringing in more than $90 million a year in gross revenue. And my fingerprints were on every bit of it. Bryce got the press. Bryce got the business magazine features. Bryce got the civic awards, the country club lunches, the photos shaking hands with mayors and chamber presidents. I got a respectable salary, nowhere close to what I was worth, and a desk in a corner office that somehow still didn't rate a window after 26 years. My ex-wife Denise warned me for years. She would look at me across the kitchen table and say, "Warren, you're building his life while ours is falling apart." She was right. I was just too proud, too stubborn, or too afraid to hear it. I kept telling myself that loyalty would pay off, that Bryce saw my value, that one day he would make it right. Denise waited 8 years for me to wake up. Then, in 2016, she filed for divorce and said, "You didn't choose me. You chose that dealership." Ellie was 18 then. Mason was 20. They handled it the way children handle something they knew was coming, but still hoped they were wrong about. Ellie kept calling me every Sunday. Mason pulled away for a long time, nearly a year before he came back around. I never blamed either of them. The truth was ugly and simple. I had been in their lives, but I had not fully been with them. My body sat at the table, but my mind lived in sales numbers, staffing shortages, quarterly reports, and the next disaster Bryce expected me to solve. And through all those years, I never once seriously questioned whether Bryce respected me. That was the first truly expensive mistake I made. The warning sign showed up on a Friday afternoon in September. I walked into the main office at our flagship location in Florence and found a man I'd never seen before sitting at the conference table, flipping through spreadsheets I had spent years refining. He was probably mid-30s, maybe a little younger, with a haircut that looked professionally maintained and a watch that cost more than my truck was worth. He had the kind of confidence that doesn't come from competence. It comes from already knowing the door was going to be opened for you. His name was Connor Harlan, Bryce's nephew. Bryce introduced him like it was nothing. "Warren, this is Connor. He's going to shadow operations for a while. Family deal. Just get him up to speed." I shook his hand and smiled, because that's what a grown man does when he senses danger, but still wants to believe it's harmless. But I felt it. Something cold settled in my stomach that day, and stayed there. For the next 3 months, Connor was everywhere. He sat in on meetings he had no business attending. He wanted copies of my reports, access to my vendor files, breakdowns of contract structures, contact lists, staffing models, inventory forecasts, system permissions. Everything I had built, protected, and maintained over more than 2 decades. And he didn't ask like a man trying to learn. He asked like a man taking inventory of property he expected to inherit. Every time I pushed back, Bryce waved me off. "Just give Connor whatever he needs, Warren. He's learning. Don't make this difficult." I kept trying to talk myself down. Told myself Bryce was just doing what people do for family. Told myself 26 years meant something. Told myself no one could simply walk into my life's work and replace me. I was wrong on every count. The morning it happened, I got to the office before sunrise the way I always did. I had gas station coffee in my hand, an inventory report spread across my desk. At 6:15, my phone rang. Bryce's assistant said, "He wants to see you upstairs." No explanation. No context. Just that tone people use when they already know the news is bad and don't want to be near the blast. I walked into Bryce's office and immediately saw Connor standing off to the side with his arms folded. That expression on his face is one of those things I'll probably remember until I die. He looked pleased, not relieved, not serious. Pleased. Like somebody waiting for the curtain to go up on a show he'd already seen in rehearsal. Bryce didn't offer me a seat. He slid one piece of paper across the desk and said, "We're restructuring operations. We need a younger direction. Today's your last day." I just stared at him. I waited for the human part. The part where he thanked me for 26 years. The part where he acknowledged what I had built. The part where he offered a severance package big enough to at least pretend he understood what he owed me. Nothing. I said, "Bryce, every system in this company has my hands on it. Every fleet relationship, every operating process, every major growth move you've made for years. I built this machine." He leaned back, looked at Connor, then back at me. "That's exactly the issue, Warren. You've gotten too comfortable acting like this place can't run without you. Connor's going to prove it can." Then he gave me that smug, lazy smile I had seen for years, directed at sales reps, vendors, competitors, anybody he thought he outranked. Only this time, it was pointed at me. "Pack up your stuff. You're done." Connor never said a word. He didn't have to. He stood there with his arms crossed like a man who believed he had just won something. I walked back to my office, feeling like my body had gone numb from the neck down. I took the picture of Ellie and Mason off my shelf. I grabbed the mug Mason had given me for Father's Day 6 years earlier. It said, "World's most underrated dad." He'd meant it as a joke, but even then it had landed a little too close to the truth. I put those things into a cardboard box. 26 years, reduced to one box. That's what a career looks like when the wrong person decides your life's work is replaceable. Nobody really spoke to me on the way out. A few people looked up from their desks with that expression people wear when they know something terrible has happened, but they're too afraid to be associated with it. I stepped outside into broad daylight, and the thing that almost broke me wasn't the firing itself. It was how ordinary the day looked. The sky was blue. Cars were pulling in. Salesmen were laughing near the showroom. The world had the nerve to keep going. That night I sat alone in my apartment and made the mistake of opening Facebook. There was Denise's post. Public. Visible to everyone. "Heard the big news. Guess some people really do top out at ordinary." Trent's laughing emoji. 47 likes. Comments from people who had eaten turkey at my table saying things like, "Saw this coming," and Not surprised. Mason called me around 9. He was furious. "Dad, I'm calling her." I told him not to. Ellie called half an hour later crying and said, "Please don't read the comments." I told her I was okay. I was not okay. I was 54, unemployed, publicly mocked, and sitting at a kitchen table doing financial triage on the back of a grocery receipt. The number I kept circling in my head was the same one. That old bank account. That little account my grandfather told me never to touch. By morning, I convinced myself I had no choice. I pulled into Heritage Bank a little after 9. It sat on a quiet street under old trees, the kind of building that still looked like money used to look before glass towers and touchscreen kiosks took over. Brick walls, worn floors. A lobby where you could almost imagine somebody's grandmother cashing a check in 1978 and still being greeted by name. I sat in my truck for a minute before going in. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was beyond both. I was numb in that dangerous way people get when too much has happened in too short a time, and the mind starts rationing emotion just to keep the body moving. I had a simple plan. Close the account, take the cash, stretch it as far as possible, then start sending out resumes no one was going to want from a 54-year-old operations man when a company could hire somebody 30 for half the money. I stepped up to the teller window and gave the young woman my name and the account number. She typed it in, and I watched her face change. Not dramatically. Worse than that. Her pleasant expression froze. She stared at the screen, then at me, then back to the screen. Finally, she said, "One moment, Mr. Cole. I need to get someone from the back." I stood there feeling embarrassed before I even knew why. I assumed something had gone wrong and that it would somehow turn out to be my fault. Maybe the account had been closed years ago. Maybe I was in the wrong branch. Maybe there were fees or paperwork issues I didn't understand. 3 long minutes later, Martin Vale came out from the back. Silver hair, tailored suit, calm eyes. He shook my hand with the seriousness of a man greeting someone under unusual circumstances and said, "Mr. Cole, if you don't mind, please come with me. We need to discuss your account privately." He led me through a back hallway and into a corner office with a wooden desk, leather chairs, and a framed painting of the river on the wall. Then he closed the door, sat down across from me, and folded his hands like a man who had rehearsed the next sentence. "Mr. Cole," he said, "this is not a normal savings account. Your grandfather, Calvin Cole, made a private investment in 1968 that was structured through a custodial trust connected to this account long before you were born." I honestly didn't know what language he was speaking. He continued anyway. "The visible savings balance was nominal," he explained. "The real asset attached to the account was an equity position in a private logistics company called Ironcrest Freight." I had never heard the name in my life. Then he told me the story. In 1968, Calvin's closest friend needed $10,000 to buy his first freight truck and start a hauling company. Calvin gave him the money. But instead of treating it like a loan, he took equity in the company. That company grew. One truck became a fleet. Local freight became regional distribution. Then multi-state operations. Then a serious logistics business with more than 3,000 employees across 14 states. And my grandfather never sold a share. Martin slid a portfolio summary across the desk. I looked at it, and for a moment the numbers meant nothing, because they were too far outside the scale of my life to register as real. The equity holding was valued at $47 million. A separate trust account containing reinvested distributions held just over $11 million. I looked up at him, and said the only thing my brain could produce. "There's no way." He shook his head gently. "There is no error, Mr. Cole." Before I could say anything else, the side door opened. 2 security men stepped in first. Then the woman in the navy blazer entered. Tall, composed, quiet in that dangerous way truly competent people often are. She set a leather briefcase on the desk, extended her hand, and said, "Good morning, Chairman Cole. I'm Evelyn Price, counsel to the Ironcrest Trust. We've been trying to locate you for 3 years. I shook her hand, mostly because instinct took over where reason had failed. My voice barely worked when I asked, "Chairman of what?" She sat down, opened her briefcase, and placed a sealed folder on the desk in front of me. "Before I explain that," she said, "there is something your grandfather left for you. You were never supposed to receive it until a specific legal condition was triggered. That condition has now been met." I stared at the folder like it might explode. Inside was a yellowed envelope with my name written across the front in handwriting I recognized instantly. Calvin's. Even after all those years, I knew it immediately. That careful slanted print he used on invoices, Christmas cards, birthday envelopes, every practical thing in his life. Seeing it again after more than 2 decades felt like hearing a dead man clear his throat in the same room. I opened the envelope. Inside was a 2-page handwritten letter dated November 14th, 1998. The year I started working for Bryce Harlan. My grandfather had written it 3 years before he died, and sealed it with instructions that it was only to be opened if a certain legal trigger activated. I started reading. "Warren," it began. "If this letter is in your hands, then the day I planned for has arrived, and I expect I am no longer here to see it. That is all right. Some things are meant to ripen in silence." I had to stop after that first part because my eyes blurred. Then I kept going. He explained everything. In 1968, his closest friend, Thomas Vance, came to him desperate for money. Thomas had a dream of starting a freight business, but couldn't get a bank to touch him. Calvin had saved $10,000 from years of brutal work at the garage. He gave Thomas every cent on one condition. He didn't want repayment. He wanted equity in whatever the company became. Thomas agreed. The deal was put on paper by a local attorney for $50 and sealed, as my grandfather put it, the proper way, with signatures and a handshake. Thomas's little hauling company became Ironcrest Freight. It grew slowly at first, then much faster through the 1980s and 1990s as freight networks expanded across the Midwest. Calvin told no one. Not my grandmother, not my mother, not me. He watched the investment grow in silence for decades. When it crossed into serious wealth, he worked with attorneys to create a trust structure linked to my childhood savings account at Heritage Bank. The money in the account itself was never the real asset. It was camouflage, a shell, a harmless-looking door hiding something enormous behind it. Then came the part that nearly undid me. "I kept this from you on purpose," he wrote, "not because I doubted you, but because I needed you to become the kind of man who could stand on his own before he ever learned he had somewhere soft to fall. I watched what my son became. I watched him leave his wife and child and drift away from every obligation he ever made. I swore you would grow differently. Character built with a hidden cushion beneath it is not the same thing as character built on bare ground." I stopped reading again. I pressed the paper to my chest and sat there in that office while Martin Vale and Evelyn Price stayed silent. I didn't feel like my grandfather was haunting the room. It felt more intimate than that, more solid. like the memory of a calloused hand on the back of your shoulder. When I finally read the last section, everything snapped into place. Back when Calvin and Thomas made their agreement, they had included a governance clause. If the Vance family's controlling interest in Ironcrest ever fell below 51%, the largest non-family private shareholder, or that shareholder's designated heir, would be offered the chairmanship of the board. My grandfather wrote, "Thomas and I believe the people who helped build a thing should not vanish from its history once money arrived. If his family protects what he built, this clause will never matter. If they do not, you will step in when the time is right. By then I expect you will have earned the shoulders for it." Evelyn confirmed the rest. Thomas Vance died in 2009. His grandchildren inherited the controlling block of shares. About 3 years earlier, they had begun selling pieces of it off to fund private ventures. Luxury projects, side businesses, vanity deals. Eventually, their ownership dipped below the 51% threshold. That activated the clause. The board began tracing the rightful heir to Calvin Cole's stake. The search led them back to Heritage Bank. And Heritage Bank had effectively been waiting for me to walk in and identify myself. Evelyn looked at me and said, "Mr. Cole, you are now the largest private shareholder in Ironcrest Freight. The board has voted to nominate you as chairman. The role carries full voting authority, executive committee participation, and a compensation package we can review whenever you're ready." I sat there, in the same boots I had worn to get fired the day before, and asked the question that felt bigger than the money, bigger than the title, bigger than any of it. My grandfather fixed cars in a 2-bay garage. How did he know enough to build something like this? Martin smiled then. "In my experience," he said, "the people who build quietly are often the ones thinking the farthest ahead." I called my mother from the parking lot. My hands were still shaking. When she answered, I said, "Mom, did you know what Grandpa Calvin did?" She went silent for so long I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then she said, "Before he died, he told me one thing. He said, 'That boy is going to be all right. He just won't know it for a while.'" I never understood what he meant. I sat there in my truck and cried harder than I had since the day we buried him. The first place I went after the bank was my mother's house. I didn't call. I just drove there the way I used to after long Saturdays at the garage, when I'd come home with dirty hands and a head full of stories about whatever Calvin had taught me. My mother opened the door, looked at my face, and knew immediately that something major had happened. She didn't ask in the doorway. She stepped aside, let me in, and put the kettle on, the same way she's done my whole life whenever life got too loud to sort out standing up. We sat at her kitchen table, the same one I'd eaten cereal at as a kid, and I told her everything. The trust, the company, the $47 million, the additional $11 million, the board, the letter, the clause. She listened the way only mothers know how to listen, quietly, without interrupting, without making the moment about themselves. When I finally finished, she looked up toward the ceiling and said, "That man, that stubborn, brilliant, impossible man. All those years I was trying to get him to eat more vegetables, and he was apparently engineering the future." Then she laughed. Then she cried. Then she laughed again. And I sat there, watching my 79-year-old mother get hit by the same emotional whiplash I'd been living inside since morning. I called Ellie that evening. She answered on the first ring, because that's the kind of daughter she is. I told her the whole thing, and when I finished, there were about 10 seconds of total silence before she said, "Dad, are you serious? Like, Actually serious? I said I was. She started crying, then laughing through the tears, and then said, "Great-Grandpa Calvin was secretly the coolest man in the family, and I'm mad I only got 3 years with him." Mason was harder to catch. He was working a late shift at the warehouse. When he finally called back and I told him, he got quiet in that way he does when something hits him too hard for words at first. Then he said, "Grandpa used to tell me you were his favorite project. I thought he meant teaching you engines." No, he meant all of it. Over the next 2 weeks, I met with the Ironcrest board. I bought my first new suit in more than a decade. I sat across tables from executives running a company that stretched through 14 states and employed more than 3,000 people, and I expected to feel like an imposter. I didn't. That surprised me at first, but only for a minute. Then I understood. 26 years of operations management, vendor negotiations, personnel crises, expansion planning, and problem-solving under pressure had built exactly the muscles I needed for that room. Calvin knew that was what would happen. He didn't just hide money from me. He designed a timeline. He let me become the man first. Then the title arrived. I accepted the chairmanship. And while all that was happening, back in Florence, Bryce Harlan's empire started coming apart. Connor lasted 7 weeks before the first major disaster hit. One of our biggest fleet clients, a relationship I had personally maintained for 12 years, called to renegotiate. Connor mishandled it so badly, they pulled the entire contract. That account alone was worth about $1.4 million a year. Gone. Within 3 months, 2 locations shut down. Turnover spiked. Sales dipped hard across the chain. Systems I had built began failing under people who didn't understand why they worked in the first place. Bryce called me in December. I saw his number and nearly let it ring out. But I answered because part of me needed to hear the sound of that moment. His voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. No swagger, no polish, just strain. "Warren," he said, "we could really use your expertise during this transition. I'd be happy to bring you back on as a consultant. We'd make it worth your time." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window of an office that for the first time in my professional life had a view. Then I said, "I appreciate the offer, Bryce, but my life has moved in a different direction. I wish you and Connor the best." And I hung up. I'm not going to pretend that didn't feel good. It did. But not because it felt like revenge. It felt like a door closing, exactly when it should have. Denise saw the local coverage about my appointment to the Ironcrest board. 3 days later, she texted me. "Congratulations, Warren. Always knew you had more in you than people realized." I read it once. Then I set the phone down and never responded. Some messages are too late to deserve an answer. 6 months after all of this, I bought a house. Not a mansion. Not some ridiculous place built to impress strangers. A 3-bedroom with a front porch and a big yard, 3 streets from my mother's home in Covington. She comes over every Sunday for dinner. Ellie enrolled in veterinary school, and I'm paying her tuition in full. Mason used a gift from me to start a small equipment rental business, and he's already making it work because there is more of Calvin in that boy than he even knows. I also started the Calvin Cole Foundation. It provides scholarships for kids in Covington being raised by single parents or grandparents. The first 5 scholarships were awarded at the local high school in a ceremony small enough to still feel real. No oversized production, no polished nonsense. Just people in folding chairs and a gym that smelled faintly like floor wax and memories. My mother handed out the certificates. She stood at the podium in her Sunday dress and said, "My father was a mechanic who believed every child deserves a real chance to start, whether anyone is standing there clapping or not." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. I was in the front row, and for a few seconds I couldn't even see. I think about Calvin every single day. I think about what kind of discipline it must have taken to keep that secret for 30 years. To watch me struggle, to watch my marriage fail, to watch me pour my life into another man's business, to never once sit me down and say, "You don't have to do this. You're already safe." He stayed silent because he understood something I didn't. If he had told me at 25, I would have made different choices. If he had told me at 30, maybe I would have quit too early. If he had told me at 40, maybe I would have leaned on money instead of becoming the person I needed to become. He did not hand me an easy life. He handed me time. And time did what quick money never could. It revealed me to myself. I walked into that bank thinking I was there to pull out grocery money from a forgotten account. I walked out as the largest private shareholder in a company I had never heard of, holding a letter from a dead mechanic who had believed in the man I would become long before I ever did. That's the part that still gets me. Not the money, not the title, not the look on Bryce Harlan's face when everything he built started caving in without me. It's this. A quiet man in steel-toe boots loved me enough to think 50 years ahead. And when the worst day of my life arrived, he had already been there, waiting for me. If this story hit you in the chest, tap like and share it with someone who needs the reminder that life can turn in a single day. And tell me in the comments about the moment you thought everything was over, only to find out it was actually the beginning.